I never thought that something so innocent, so instinctual, so seemingly harmless as offering comfort to someone hurting could lead me to the edge of a life I barely recognized as my own, that the small act of listening, of giving time, of being a safe place for someone else's pain would grow into a labyrinth I could not find my way out of. But I suppose that's how these things always begin. Not with intentions, but with needs we don't admit to ourselves, with the soft, aching places inside us that have gone unseen for so long they start reaching outward before we even realize it. And he was just a boy in my memory, my best friend's son. The one I had watched run barefoot through backyards and fall asleep in the back seat after long days at the lake. The one whose face I used to wipe when he scraped his knees, whose stories I used to listen to even when they were endless and childish, and somewhere between then and now he became a man with grief in his eyes and too much silence around him, a man who sat across from me at my kitchen table with a weariness that was too big for his age, and when he told me, voice low and rough and barely controlled, that he didn't know how to keep going without his mother, without my best friend who had been the glue holding his life together, and who was now just a memory we were all trying to pretend wasn't fading, I felt something deep and maternal and aching crack open inside me, and I reached across the table and touched his hand without thinking, not out of anything but love, out of sorrow, out of the desperate wish to take some of his pain away, and maybe that's where it started. Not in desire, not in longing, but in sorrow, in two broken people trying to patch the holes inside themselves with whatever scraps of connection they could find. And I told myself that comforting him was the right thing, the human thing, the good thing. That he needed someone and I could be that someone without risking anything, because after all, I was safe. I was stable, I was married, I was beyond these foolish, reckless entanglements that belonged to younger, stupider versions of myself, that I had long since outgrown. But as the days turned into weeks and he kept coming back, kept finding excuses to stay longer, to sit a little closer, to tell me stories he hadn't told anyone else, to ask questions about his mother, about life, about love, about everything he felt lost without, I felt myself changing in ways I didn't want to admit, felt my heart waking up from a long, gray sleep I hadn't even realized I was trapped inside. Because when you've been invisible long enough, when you've been living inside a marriage where conversations become schedules and touch becomes obligation and attention becomes habit, even the smallest glimmer of being truly seen can feel like sunlight after years underground, and he saw me. Not the version of me I performed for the world, not the efficient wife or the reliable friend or the dependable neighbor, but the messy, aching, restless person I had buried beneath years of doing what was expected. And it terrified me how easily I responded to that recognition, how much I wanted to lean into it, how much I started needing to see him smile because of something I said, needing to hear him ask for my advice, needing to be important to someone in a way I hadn't felt important in. So long that I'd convinced myself I didn't need it anymore, and I hated that feeling, hated the part of me that came alive every time he texted just to say he missed talking to me, or dropped by with some excuse to linger in my kitchen long after the coffee had gone cold, and I told myself that it was harmless, that I was helping him heal, that I was offering a kindness no one else could. But in the secret places of my mind I knew that wasn't the whole truth, knew that part of me wasn't doing this for him at all but for myself, for the way it filled something hollow inside me that I didn't even realize had become cavernous over the years, and the guilt of it gnawed at me constantly, a low, steady hum beneath every smile, every word, every moment we shared, but not enough to make me stop, not enough to make me pull away, because loneliness is a hunger that makes you grateful for crumbs, and what he gave me, the way he listened, the way he saw me, the way he needed me felt like a feast after years of starvation, and I started living for the moments I could be near him, started arranging my days in small, secret ways to make space for him. Started checking my phone compulsively even though I knew how dangerous it was to hope for his name to light up my screen, and I told myself again and again that it was still innocent, that nothing had happened, that everything was still safe. But innocence isn't about actions. It's about intentions, and mine were no longer clean, no longer pure, no longer just about helping him heal, and deep down I knew it, and every time I stayed up late thinking about our conversations, every time I caught myself smiling at a message longer than was appropriate, every time I felt that tiny spark of excitement when he walked into the room, I knew I was lying, not just to my husband, not just to him, but to myself. And the lie was growing heavier every day, and there were moments when I caught him looking at me in ways he shouldn't, with a tenderness too raw to be casual, and I should have said something, should have drawn a line, should have reminded both of us who we were supposed to be to each other. But I didn't, because I didn't want to. Because for the first time in what felt like forever, someone looked at me like I was the beginning of something, not the end, and I didn't have the strength to turn away from that, not after so long spent being background noise in my own life. And so I kept going, kept listening, kept offering comfort that was slowly turning into something neither of us could name out loud, but both of us felt growing larger and heavier with every passing day, and deep inside, beneath the layers of denial and guilt and shame, I knew I was losing myself, knew I was becoming someone I would barely recognize if I ever truly stopped and looked at the truth. But I wasn't ready to look yet, wasn't ready to give up the feeling of mattering to someone again, even if it meant destroying the very things I once thought were unshakable. And that is how it happens, not with betrayal that storms the gates of your life, but with longing that sneaks in through the cracks you never thought to seal. And I suppose if I am being honest, brutally honest in the way I never allow myself to be in the daylight, in the way that only creeps in during those terrible soft hours when the house is asleep and the air presses down on me like punishment, I would have to admit that I stopped being a bystander in my own story a long time before I let myself recognize it, that it wasn't the messages or the visits or the conversations that trapped me, but the choices I made quietly, invisibly, the ones that looked like nothing to anyone else, but that I felt like earthquakes under my skin, because somewhere along the way comforting him turned into needing him, needing the sound of his voice, saying my name without obligation. Needing the slow unfolding of his thoughts in late-night messages that I read over and over again in the dark. Needing the way his sadness mirrored my own so perfectly it made me feel less alone, less strange, less broken. And every day I told myself that nothing had happened, that I was still in control, that this was manageable, containable, deniable, but the lie grew heavier every day, a stone I carried hidden in my chest, pressing against my ribs with every breath, and I thought I could live with it. Thought I could keep it locked away in the private spaces of my mind where no one would ever see, but the truth is that secrets rot you from the inside out, slowly at first, subtly, like a hairline crack in a dam that looks harmless until the entire structure collapses, and the crack had already begun long before I noticed, had already split wide enough that my heart no longer belonged fully to the life I had built, and it shames me to admit how much I loved it, how much I craved the stolen moments, the private jokes, the careful messages that danced just to the edge of something that couldn't be named without destroying everything, and sometimes when I was with my husband, doing the ordinary things, cooking, folding laundry, driving to dinner, parties, I would catch myself thinking of him instead, wondering what he was doing, wondering if he was thinking of me, and the realization of that betrayal, even silent, even unspoken, was like a blow to the chest I could barely recover from. But not enough to stop me, never enough to stop me, and I lived for the stolen messages that came late at night, the ones that started with casual observations and slid inevitably into confessions neither of us should have made, admissions about loneliness, about Emptiness, about the way the world felt hollow without certain people in it, and I would type and delete 100 versions of the things I wanted to say, the things I was afraid to say, the things I already knew he would understand without needing to hear. Because there is a language between two broken people that doesn't require words, and we were fluent in it long before either of us dared to acknowledge it. And I hated how easy it became to lie, how easy it became to keep parts of my day cordoned off, private, sacred in ways they should never have been. How natural it felt to slip into the secret world we had built between us, a world where nothing was technically wrong, but everything was already ruined, and the guilt of it clung to me constantly. An invisible weight that I carried into every room, that coded every conversation with my family, every interaction with my friends, every moment I was supposed to be fully present but wasn't, because part of me was always elsewhere. Always with him, and I wondered sometimes if anyone noticed, if the change in me was visible, if the guilt had seeped into my skin, if my husband ever looked at me across the room and saw the cracks forming, but if he did, he never said anything. Never asked, never pressed, and in a way that hurt worse than if he had, because it meant that I could slip away piece by piece and no one would come looking for me, and I don't know if I would have had the strength to save myself even if someone had. Noticed, because I was already too far gone, already too tethered to the feeling of being wanted, of being needed, of being central to someone's world again, and it didn't matter that it was wrong. It didn't matter that it would end badly. It didn't matter that I would lose more than I could ever hope to gain, because when you are starving, even poisoned food smells like salvation, and I told myself stories to justify it, stories about fate and timing and loneliness, about how we were two people simply trying to survive our grief, about how nothing physical had happened so it couldn't really be called betrayal. But deep down I knew those stories were lies, beautifully crafted lies I wrapped around myself like a second skin. And every day the truth gnawed at me a little more, made the world feel a little less solid beneath my feet, made the life I had built feel more and more like a set I was acting on rather than a home I lived in, and I don't know when exactly I started fantasizing about escape, about disappearing into a version of my life where it was only us, where there were no consequences, no guilt, no eyes watching, only the aching, desperate simplicity of being seen and understood and wanted. And even though I hated myself for it, hated the way those thoughts took root and flowered in the secret corners of my mind, I couldn't stop them, couldn't rip them out no matter how hard I tried, and I kept thinking I would stop, kept promising myself that the next message would be the last, that the next lingering glance would be the last, that the next conversation that left my heart racing and my cheeks burning would be the last. But every promise crumbled the second I saw his name on my screen, the second I heard his voice, the second I remembered what it felt like to matter to someone in a way that didn't feel obligatory or mechanical or routine, and I knew it couldn't last, knew it was unsustainable, knew it was heading toward a cliff I couldn't avoid, no matter how tightly I gripped the wheel, but still I kept driving faster, kept leaning harder, kept needing more, because the alternative was to go back to the silence, back to the numbness, back to the slow, suffocating death of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't, and I think that's the real tragedy of it. Not that I betrayed my husband, not that I lied to my friends, not even that I corrupted something that should have remained pure between me and my best friend's son, but that somewhere along the way I stopped believing I deserved anything better than the lie I was living, and once you believe that, once you accept that this, the secrecy, the guilt, the fear, the hunger, is the best you're going to get, it's almost impossible to choose anything else, almost impossible to reach for anything cleaner or kinder or truer, and so I stayed, and so I answered every message. And so I smiled every time he said something that made the hollow places inside me ache with gratitude, And so I buried myself a little deeper every day, knowing that when the collapse came, it would not be sudden, it would be the slow, grinding kind of ruin that leaves you awake in the middle of the night wondering when exactly you stopped being someone you could be proud of and became whatever this was instead. And it didn't happen all at once, didn't explode in some dramatic revelation or catastrophic mistake, didn't burst into my life like a storm tearing through a house. No, it happened quietly, slowly, invisibly, in the private spaces between what was said and what was meant, in the silences that stretched longer than they should have, in the messages that stayed too long unsent, but still burned on the tips of our fingers, in the way his eyes found mine even when there were others in the room, in the way my heart answered before my mind had a chance to argue. And I think a part of me always knew that comfort would become need, that need would become longing, that longing would become something far more dangerous, something sharp and heavy and irreversible. And I kept telling myself that I was strong enough to stop it, that I would recognize the moment before the line was crossed and choose differently, that the weight of loyalty and guilt and fear would be enough to anchor me. But the truth is, by the time I realized I was standing on the wrong side of everything I believed about myself, I had already stepped so far over the line that I couldn't even see it anymore, and there was one night. A night so painfully vivid that it feels more real in my memory than most of the life I still pretend to live. A night when the air between us was so thick with everything we hadn't said that speaking aloud would have broken the fragile thread of control we were both clinging to. A night when he looked at me, really looked at me, and in that look I saw every confession we had buried, every thought we had left unspoken, every small, desperate prayer for something we both knew we could never have. And I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't dare breathe too loudly, because I knew that if I did, everything would come crashing down. And yet in that silence, something shifted, something surrendered, and without a word, without a single reckless gesture, we both understood that we had already betrayed everyone we loved and everything we had sworn to protect, not with our bodies, but with our hearts. And it was somehow worse, somehow more devastating, because there would be no forgiveness for a betrayal that left no evidence. No wound to point to, no scar to justify the pain, only the lingering ache of a connection that shouldn't exist, and the knowledge that we had nurtured it into something that lived and breathed and devoured us both. And after that night, everything changed, or maybe nothing changed, and only I did, because every conversation became weighted. Every touch of fingers on coffee cups or glances across rooms became charged, became dangerous, became a reminder of the thing we had allowed to grow between us. And the fear of exposure wrapped itself around my throat tighter every day, making it harder to smile, harder to speak, harder to pretend, and the guilt hollowed me out until I was a shell moving through my life on autopilot, performing the role of the wife, the friend, the woman who was always dependable, always predictable, always safe, while inside I was unraveling, slipping further into a darkness of my own making. And I kept thinking that if I just stayed quiet, if I just kept everything locked inside, if I never acted on the things I felt, it would be okay, it would fade, it would die of starvation. But it didn't. It grew stronger, louder, hungrier. And I started to wonder if maybe it would be easier if it all came out, if someone discovered the messages, if someone saw the way he looked at me, if someone forced me to confess, to choose, to break open the life I had already poisoned beyond repair. Because carrying the secret was killing me more slowly and more thoroughly than any scandal ever could. And there were nights when I would lie awake beside my husband, listening to his even breathing, feeling the distance between us like a canyon, and I would think about how easily I had become a stranger to him, to myself, to everyone who thought they knew me. And the loneliness of that realization was so complete that it felt like drowning, like being buried alive in a life I no longer knew how to live. and I kept asking myself how it had happened, how I had let it happen, and the answers were never satisfying, never simple, because it wasn't one thing, it was everything. It was grief and loneliness and silence and the slow erosion of hope. It was needing to be seen and heard and held in ways that had nothing to do with bodies and everything to do with souls. And I think that's the part that hurts most of all. The part that makes the guilt feel endless and inescapable. That I didn't betray my marriage for passion or excitement or revenge, but for the simple, devastating ache of wanting to matter again, of wanting to be known in the places I had long since given. Up on being seen, and now here I am, months later, years maybe, it's hard to tell, moving through a life that looks so intact from the outside that sometimes I almost believe the lie myself, almost believe that nothing happened, that I am still who I used to be. But I know better. I know the truth lives inside me like a scar that never fades, a reminder that I am not invincible, not immune, not safe, that I am capable of destruction as profound and as quiet as a single seed planted deep enough to split a mountain in two. And I wonder sometimes if he thinks about it still, if he carries the same weight I do, if he looks at his own life and feels the same hollow ache in the spaces where we used to find each other without ever touching. And sometimes, when the night is too quiet and the memories press too hard against the inside of my ribs, I let myself imagine what might have happened if we had been braver or weaker or more reckless, if we had given into the pull between us and let it destroy everything. And even though I know it would have ended in ruin, even though I know the cost would have been unbearable, part of me aches for that fantasy, because at least then the ruin would have matched the wreckage inside me now. At least then there would be no pretending, no smiling through the endless gray of a life that feels so much smaller, so much sadder, so much more hollow than it ever did before. And I don't know if I will ever find a way back to who I was, or if she is. Simply gone, lost in the quiet, devastating collision between loneliness and need. But I do know that some mistakes don't kill you. They just leave you walking through the ruins forever, trying to remember what it felt like to believe you were safe.